In the last video, we saw what is graph and the terms used in the graph. In this video, we will discuss about the types of graphs. Graphs can be divided into different types based on various factors. The first one we would take is direction of edge. If all the edges in the graph are directed, means if all the edges have directions, then that graph is called directed graph. If edges doesn't pose any direction, then that graph is called undirected graph. So based on the direction of edges, we have two types of graphs. The first one is directed graph, second one is the undirected graph. Let's talk about undirected graph. In an undirected graph, all the edges are bidirectional. Example, here A and B node is having bidirectional edges. It means that we can travel from point A to B and B to A. Here edges do not point in any specific direction. In the directed graph, all the edges are unidirectional. For example, here we can travel from point A to B but cannot travel from B to A. Here edges are pointing to a particular direction. Let's talk about the next factor based on which the type of the graph is decided, and that factor is weight. So here we can again see two types, weighted graph and unweighted graph. In weighted graph, each edge is assigned with a cost or weight. The value can indicate length, cost, weight, height, etc. If edges are having values, then that graph is called weighted. And if edges does not have any value, then it is unweighted graph. Say for example, this is weighted graph. Every edge in this graph having values assigned. And suppose if we want to find the path from A to E, we can have multiple paths here and we can calculate the cost as well. Say for example, here the cost of the path from B to D is 5, as value of its edge is 5. And the value of the path from A to C is 3. Value of edge A to B plus value of edge B to C, that is 1 plus 2 is equal to 3. Cost of A to E is 6. Value of edge A to B is 1. Value of edge B to C is 2. Value of edge C to E is 3. So the cost is 1 plus 2 plus 3 is equal to 6. As I said, there can be multiple paths. Another path we can have from A to E is ADE, and the cost is 6 plus 4 is equal to 10. So this is all about weighted and unweighted graph. The next type of graph is decided based on cycle. Graph can be cyclic or acyclic. A graph is cyclic if it contains a path which starts from the vertex and ends at the same vertex. A graph contains a cycle, then that graph is called cyclic. If it doesn't, then it is called acyclic graph. Say for example, if I consider the path ABDA, we can see that the path is started from A and ends at A. As graph is having cycle, so it is called cyclic graph. Tree is also a graph which has no cycle. This is the acyclic graph. So far in this video, we saw how to classify the types of graph based on factors. The first one is based on direction, that is directed and undirected graph. If the edges in the graph has directions, then that graph is called directed graph. If the edges are not having any direction, then that graph is called undirected graph. Next factor is weight. If the edges of the graph contains any value, then that graph is called weighted graph. And if the edges doesn't have any values, then that graph is unweighted graph. Next factor is cycle. If the path in a graph consists any cycle, then that graph is called cyclic graph. Else the graph is acyclic graph. Please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and please hit on bell icon to get notified whenever we post new videos. Install DSA application from the Google Play Store or from the link given in the description below. Please let us know if you have any queries in the comment section below. And thank you for watching.